there is the invocation, Most Holy Theotokos, save us, right? And that sometimes is a bit of a shock to the system of folks who come from a Protestant background and who are accustomed to using the language of saving only in reference to the person of Christ. And here I would point out a couple of things that we probably need to remember about language in general and theological language in general. That even though within our contemporary and in many cases in Reformation and post-Reformation context, there's a tendency to use words in very straightforward ways that have a singular static meaning. So save refers to salvation, right? And when we talk about being saved, we talk specifically about being saved from final judgment by the work of Christ. But what we find is that historically these words have a great spectrum of meaning. So for example, when we look at the book of James, one of the things that James talks about is he says, if you turn a brother from sin, you have saved him. Well, clearly, James can't mean that you've in some ways, made atonement for him or done the type of work that Christ has done for him. But nonetheless, James is recognizing that in turning that person away, you become an instrument of their salvation. And the church fathers recognize this as well. They recognize that we can talk about being saved, right? But we can talk about these instruments of salvation that are used through the prayers of the Holy Fathers, save us, or asking the Theotokos to save us. We might also recognize that save doesn't always refer to salvation as such. Many of these prayers were oftentimes offered in a context where part of what they're asking to be saved from is actually in some ways a socio-political context. They're not just talking about salvation when they're talking about save us. And so I think it's important to understand these sort of spectrums of possible meanings. Another example is this word mediator. I talked about the terminology of mediator. To mediate in the Greek refers to actually bring something near, and we touched on that in a variety of places. Now, one thing that might be surprising is to find that there are certain hymns that, for example, refer to the Theotokos as mediatrix, right, as a female mediator. And so the question that naturally arises for some people is that they look at the language of St. Paul and they see that Paul says there is only one mediator. So why on earth would we ever refer to Mary as a mediator? Because there's only one mediator, the God-man, Jesus Christ. And when we look at this, what we find is that the Eastern Church Fathers, Chrysostom, for example, when looking at that passage, acknowledges that it is true, that what Paul is saying here is that there's only one mediator in the way that Christ is a mediator. And what he means in this passage, how Chrysostom interprets the passage, is he suggests that the mediation here talked about is that Christ alone is the one who unites divinity with humanity in his person. In this way, he creates a bridge between God and man and reunites us with divinity. So in that passage, Chrysostom acknowledges that that's what Paul is talking about, and he suggests that it's true that Christ is the only mediator between God and man if what we're talking about is the reality of the incarnation. No one else does that. But what we also find is a flexibility concerning the language itself. So Chrysostom and the other church fathers will also mention that there are other forms of mediation. They suggest that when we pray for each other, we are mediators, right? They talk about the ways in which the sacraments mediate God to us. And so while there is a contemporary tendency to treat words in a very static way and suggest that the word mediator can only be used in this one way, and that's why Paul will say that there is only one mediator, what he actually suggests what we actually find in the Eastern Fathers is that there's a flexibility concerning language, that the concern here is less about the word mediator and saying we can only ever use this word in this one way, but rather saying that the reality that what Paul is talking about, that Christ is unique in this way, in this type of mediation is true, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other types of mediation that happen. So they don't tend to use words in this highly static way. They have a very flexible and fluid use of language that maybe is part of what creates this type of confusion. And that type of confusion is the type of thing that refers to things like saved, right? That we can talk about Christ being the one who saves us, and it's certainly true that Christ's saving work is unique, right? No one else does what he does. But to suggest that there are no instruments of salvation is not true, and not only is it not true, it's not even in keeping with the biblical use of the language, as James himself will use save to talk about instruments of salvation, such as turning somebody away from sin. So that's just an important note to recognize the fluidity of language in the Eastern Church Fathers when it comes to theology. One word does not, that each word does not have one static meaning. It can have a variety of meanings, and it's important to look at it in context in terms of what's actually being said.